My name is Adam Sherman. I'm the research director for the IFOPA, and I'd like to thank everyone for taking the time out of your schedules to attend this webinar about clinical studies and drug development. I'm really looking forward to giving this talk and feel this topic is very timely. In many ways, this is a new dawn for FOP in terms of clinical trials. We have not just one, but we have three drugs in clinical development, and we have many other drug candidates in early stage investigation for FOP. And when you have multiple drugs and you have multiple studies, something pretty unique happens, at least in rare diseases. You gain the choice. You get to choose not only if you participate in a clinical trial, but you also get to choose which one. And with many choices comes the need to make a decision. And sometimes when you have large decisions in front of you with limited information, this can be a little bit paralyzing. So I'm hopeful that walking you through some basic clinical concepts during this talk, that it will be helpful for you and will help make the decision process a little bit easier. So behind every approved treatment, behind every approved medicine and medical device stands millions of people who have selflessly volunteered their time to participate in a clinical trial to make that possible. So participating in clinical trials can be a very empowering process, and you will be able to, by participating in clinical trial, add to the body of knowledge that we know about FOP. You'll help address some key questions about the disease. By participating in clinical trial, you'll help drug manufacturers better understand their investigational medicines. You'll help them understand if their drugs are both safe and effective. And by participating in clinical trials, you will accelerate the clinical development of these programs and address probably what is one of the most frustrating parts of drug development, which is the time it takes to bring these treatments to market. So I hope to make everyone on this webinar a little bit more knowledgeable about clinical trials and drug development and ready to make any necessary decision about participation. So I've outlined this webinar to talk a little bit about drug development and the different concepts around participating in clinical trials. I'll also talk about the benefits of participating in a clinical trial, as well as some of the risks involved, and what are the ways that these risks are managed in today's clinical trials. And then I'll provide you with some thoughts and some considerations on what you might want to think about when deciding to participate in a clinical trial. And then finally, we'll have some time at the end of this webinar to answer some of your questions. This is a webinar that you don't have to wait until the very end to answer your questions. There is a chat function as part of this webinar, and you can just submit your questions, and Michelle Davis from the IFOPA is there and will be taking your questions, which we can answer at the end. I would like to also note that this webinar is being recorded for future reference. However, once we get to the question and answer portion of the webinar, we will stop recording for privacy purposes. So I'd just like to note that before we begin, that the IFOPA does not recommend specific treatment choices, nor do we seek to influence that choice in any way. Instead, we view the IFOPA's role as to provide you the necessary information to help you make the informed decision. And with that, I'd like to baseline where everybody is before we get into more of the content and see what your current knowledge is about clinical trials. So we have 2 poll questions, and I'll ask Michelle to start the polling now. So the first question is, most drugs that enter clinical trial testing will eventually get approved by the FDA or other local regulators, such as EMA in Europe. This is a true-false question, so please submit your response. We'll give you a minute to do so. Let's see how good you are. Okay, Michelle, whenever you are ready, we'll see the results. Okay. So we have a little bit of mixture. Looks, and we'll go through the answers as we go through the presentation. Okay, and then the next question that we have for you. Most drugs that enter clinical testing will eventually get approved by FDA or other. Oops. Sorry, the second question. A blinded study means that a trial participant will not know whether they are receiving the study medication. This is true or false. And if you could submit your response. Okay, Michelle, whenever you're ready, we'll see the results. Okay, so looks like some people have a little bit of knowledge, but we'll go through these in a little bit more detail as we go through the presentation. But good to know where everybody is starting off from. Okay, so many of you have probably heard some of the statistics around drug development. You may have heard that it takes 10 to 12 years to bring a drug through drug development. It can cost upwards of $1 billion to develop a drug, and there are many, many steps involved. To many who are not in industry, these steps can seem very confusing, very complex, and often seem like a game of chutes and ladders, which you see here. But while most drugs do have a unique development program, their process for developing drugs is somewhat harmonized, and it looks a lot like this chart here. This chart shows how a drug begins and goes all the way through drug development. And we'll walk through this chart in a little bit more detail so that you can see how a drug goes through the development process and gets to the market. We'll go step by step. So drugs first start in drug discovery. This is where researchers look at whether compounds have a positive effect on a given drug's process. This is why it's important that we continue to study FOP biology. The more we know about FOP, the more we can begin targeting specific compounds, specific disease processes. Now, the most promising compounds in drug discovery will move into what's called preclinical testing. Preclinical testing is just testing in animals. And what researchers want to do and understand is whether the drug has any toxicity in an in vivo or animal model. And then if we're using, or the researchers using the right model, they begin understanding whether the drug has any positive effect on a given disease. Once the preclinical data looks good and they're ready to move forward, what happens now is the sponsor will submit what's called an IND, or an investigational new drug application. They'll submit it to the FDA. And if the FDA does not object, the sponsor could then begin conducting clinical trials in humans. In Europe, this is called the CTA, or clinical trial application. Both the IND and the CTA are very important parts of the regulatory process, and they begin the clinical trial testing. So in clinical trials are studies in humans, and they're often grouped in phases, and lucky for us, it's simply phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. Phase 1 studies are often conducted in healthy volunteers, meaning people who do not have the disease. And the goal of a phase 1 study is to assess first the safety of the medicine, but also to understand how the drug gets metabolized in the body. Now, phase 2 studies are a little bit larger in size and number of participants. Phase 2 are often studies conducted in patients who have the disease of interest. And the goal of a phase 2 is begin, again, assessing safety of the drug, looking at different dosing or just dosing regimens of the drug, and then finally also beginning to assess whether the drug has any positive effect or efficacy on the specific disease process. And then finally, we have phase 3. In phase 3, you may hear it's called a pivotal trial sometimes. And this addresses the very straightforward question: does the drug provide more benefit than the standard of care? And is the benefit of that drug outweigh any potential risk that the drug might have on someone taking it? So this is the standard process for larger diseases. In rare diseases such as FOP, there's a lot of iterations of these phases. For example, I've been on programs where we've combined a phase 1 and a phase 2. So we had a phase 1/2 followed by a phase 3. And then I've been on other programs where we had a phase 1. And then we went right into a phase 2, phase 3. So there's a lot of variations on clinical development. You'll notice the number of volunteers or participants on the bottom. This is obviously not scoped for FOP or rare diseases, but just know that generally when you go from phase 1 to 2 and 2 to 3, that the number of participants increases. But just to give you a benchmark, Regeneron is conducting a phase 2 trial in up to 40 individuals with FOP, and Clementia is conducting their phase 3 in 80 individuals with FOP. So once a sponsor completes a clinical trials, they'll summarize their clinical experience and data. They'll summarize their preclinical data along with their manufacturing, and they'll submit what's called a NDA. That stands for a new drug application. If it's a biologic, it'll be a BLA or biologic license application. And that gets submitted to the regulatory authorities, in this case, the FDA. It's an MAA in Europe for the European Medicines Agency. And these agencies will have a team of experts to review the data, and they are looking at the benefit to risk ratio of these drugs. And if they feel that the benefit outweighs the potential risks, they will grant marketing authorization to these compounds. The other point I'd like to make about this chart here is you will notice there's looks like a dark blue funnel going across your screen. You'll see a number 5 right in the middle. What this refers to is the number of drugs that must enter clinical trials for one to reach approval. So this number can increase or decrease based upon the disease or the treatment approach. But whether it's 5 to 1, 5 drugs needing to enter clinical trials to get one approved, or 10 to 1 or 2 to 1, the broader point here is that not every drug that enters clinical trials will make it to the end and become approved medicine. So this is why it's very important for our FOP community to continue to support clinical trials and have as many shots on goal as possible. So there are a variety of different types of clinical research that one can participate in, and not every one involves a drug. In fact, many clinical trials and clinical studies do not involve treatments. For example, we have registries. Registries are observational studies that collect medical information on people with a given or specific disease. And registry data is used by researchers and drug developers, as well as clinicians, to further research a given disease. In rare diseases such as FOP, registries are viewed as critical. Fortunately for us, we do have our own FOP registry, and we strongly encourage everyone in the FOP community to participate in the registry. And you can participate in the registry even if you're involved in these other studies. So if you're involved in a natural history study, you may still, and we encourage you to participate in the registry. To learn more about the registry and to also sign up, which is free, please go to the ifopa.org website to learn more and to register. Natural history studies are studies that look at the natural course of a disease over time without any treatment or without any intervention. And this is what Clementia conducted. They conducted a FOP natural history study. And then we have quality of life and burden of illness studies. You may have heard of these studies in FOP. These are studies that look at the impact of a disease on given metrics. So it could be anything from resource utilization, healthcare resource utilization. It could be productivity, and it could also be quality of life. These types of studies are important for discussions with payers and other policy makers. So the broader point and the message I'd like to communicate on this is, while I hope many of you do decide to participate in a treatment study, if you choose not to participate, or if you're not eligible, there's still a variety of ways for you to participate in clinical studies and contribute to FOP research. So many in the clinical industry, drug development industry, have a lot of buzzwords that we use when talking about clinical trials. You may hear someone saying you're conducting a double-blinded, randomized, placebo-controlled crossover study, and they may expect you to know exactly what they're talking about. So there is a lot of jargon, but I thought it would be helpful just to decode what some of these clinical terms actually mean. In clinical trials, it's pretty standard that the trial sponsor use control groups. This is a way for the researcher to assess how a study medication compares either to another study medication or to no treatment. In diseases where there are no treatments, such as FOP, it's very common to have placebo as the actual control. And a placebo is just a pill, a powder, or a solution that does not contain any active ingredient. It allows the researchers to assess how a given treatment compares to no treatment. Now, if I was to ask 100 people interested in participating in a clinical trial, how many would like to receive the placebo versus how many would like to receive the actual study medication, I'm willing to venture most, if not all, will want to receive the actual medicine. So this would create, in this situation, a bias and differences between the two groups, the placebo and the treatment arms. So what researchers do to counter this bias is they have something called randomization. And randomization is just a long word that really describes a pretty simple process of randomly assigning people to one or two different treatment arms. So you would get randomly assigned either to receive the study medication or to receive the placebo, for example. Now, study blinding does not mean you need to wear a blindfold. It just means that you don't know which medication you're receiving. For example, you don't know if you're receiving the treatment drug or whether you're receiving the placebo. And this is done to help reduce bias in the study. If you hear the term double-blinded, it just means that you and the investigator do not know which treatment arm you're in, so whether you're receiving the placebo or the actual study medication. Crossover studies is where both groups receive both the treatment, the drug, as well as the placebo, but you're just not sure which order. So, for example, you could start on a placebo and then move over and start taking the medication. Or you could start on the medication and then be crossed over to start taking the placebo. And this is done to ensure there's no bias between the two groups. It also has the added benefit that sometimes you could reduce the number of participants required to answer questions in a clinical trial. And then finally, primary endpoint is just the main question that the researcher is trying to answer in a given study. So for example, does the study medication prevent or halt the development of heterotopic ossification would be a primary endpoint in the study. So it's very important to keep in mind that clinical trials are not treatments. Clinical trials are studies that are assessing very important questions about a specific treatment. So when deciding to enroll in a clinical trial, it's, of course, you want to weigh the trial benefits, but you also need to take into consideration the trial risks and the trial costs. So in terms of potential benefits, You cannot gain access to these investigational drugs by a prescription, so you can't go to your physician and ask for a prescription for these medicines, and they're only available by participating in a clinical trial. So if the drug is ultimately approved and viewed as safe and effective, you will have had access to this medicine years before it's commercially available. Patients who participate in a clinical trial will be seen by many medical experts. So you'll receive at a minimum some of the best clinical care, often at free or no cost to you. And then as mentioned, approved therapies are only available because people have often decided to participate in a clinical trial. So by participating in these clinical trials, you may be helping future FOPers to have access to helpful medicines. So with any benefits, you always have to consider the risks. On the risk side, the drug may not work. Or maybe the drug works for others and it just doesn't work for you. Most drugs have side effects. And if you experience a side effect, it could be mild or moderate. And it could be also severe and life-threatening. And then as discussed, you may also not receive a drug at all and be given a placebo. However, if you are in a trial that has a placebo, most studies have what's called the open label portion. So once you are done with a specific placebo section of the study, you'll be given access to the study medication. So fortunately, in today's clinical trial, there are many safeguards in place to protect you during your participation in a clinical trial. Now, we can never have a risk minimized to zero, but these protections are in place to minimize the risk as much as possible. They fall into 4 different buckets. That's informed consent, scientific review, institutional review boards, and data safety monitoring boards, or DSMBs. Now, informed consents are is just the process by which you learn about the clinical trial. So you'll learn about the objectives of the study, what procedures you'll have to go through. You'll learn about how your data will be used. You'll also be learning about the potential benefits as well as the potential risks and side effects of the study medication. The informed consent is done at the beginning of a clinical trial, which allows you the opportunity to ask all the questions that you need to have answered in order to make an informed decision about participating in a clinical trial. Now, scientific review is around study guidelines. Guidelines for studies are documented in what's called a clinical protocol. And clinical protocols are really just recipes for how a clinical study will be conducted. And they ensure that every investigator at every center, regardless of the country, is conducting the clinical study in the exact same way. Now, clinical protocols are drafted by medical professionals, they're reviewed by medical professionals, and they're approved by medical professionals. And many of these professionals are experienced or experts in that given disease. One of the bodies that reviews these clinical protocols is called an Institutional Review Board, or IRB. And IRBs are administrative boards made up of independent medical specialists who are qualified to both review and approve clinical protocols. IRBs make sure patient rights are protected and the risks involved in the study are reasonable with respect to the potential benefits. And IRBs have the authority to both approve and disapprove clinical protocols. And then finally, we have DSMBs, or Data Safety Monitoring Boards. DSMBs are in place in any study that is multi-center and is also uses randomization. And DSMBs are made up of physicians and statisticians and other medical experts. And their main goal is to review ongoing clinical trials to make sure that patient rights and safety are being met. DSMBs have the power to stop clinical trials if the objectives of that clinical trial are not being met or if a safety issue arises. So if you've decided that you're interested in participating in a clinical trial, one of the first questions you have to ask yourself is, are you eligible to participate? Most clinical protocols have eligibility criteria. In the clinical world, they're called inclusion and exclusion criteria. And this spells out who's able to and who's not able to participate in a clinical trial. Now, if you happen to be excluded from a clinical trial that you're interested in, you should not take this as a personal rejection. Just know that inclusion and exclusion criteria are set up first and foremost to protect patient safety, and second, to ensure that the sponsor of the study is able to address the very specific questions that they have. For example, it's very common to start clinical trials in adults before moving into kids or pediatrics. So you often see age as an inclusion criteria. Additionally, sometimes disease severity, also participation in other clinical trials may be an exclusion criteria. These inclusion and exclusion criteria are very specific to each given study and the primary endpoints that they're looking to address. So there are many considerations when deciding which trial is right for you, and I've listed these here. I would venture to say that the first two bullet points are by far the most important considerations for you. You need to consider which study gives you the best benefit to potential risk of the medication. And this is a conversation that I would suggest you have with your physician, assessing the safety and effectiveness of the medications. Again, you want the medication that gives you the best ratio of effectiveness to risk. Although less of an issue in the United States and in Europe and some other countries, but these studies need to be conducted by a qualified investigator at a qualified institution with the safeguards that we previously mentioned. Other considerations include access to treatment both during but also after the trial. Will you be receiving study medication when the trial is complete? Is there an extension trial, for example? What is the route of administration of the drug? Administration just means how is the drug given? So is it oral? Is it given by an IV, for example? How often is the drug administered? What's the frequency? And then what is your time commitment? And what's your needs? How often do you have to visit the sites? Again, these are all important considerations, but please keep in mind the first two as you're weighing clinical trials. Again, you want the best drug is the most efficacious and has the best safety profile for your condition. So this is a very busy slide, and I apologize, but please feel free to email me for these list of questions. We'll also see if we can get these posted on the IFOPA website. But the main message here is that you can and should ask questions before deciding to participate in a clinical trial. I suggest you write down the list of questions that you have when speaking to a trial investigator. That way you have all the answers you need to make an informed decision. I also suggest that you not only ask about participation in the study in terms of the logistics, how often, what procedures you'll need to go through as part of the study, but you also ask questions about the medication. You want to know about the potential benefits as well as the potential risks of the study medication. And these are all decisions that you want to have before deciding whether to participate in any trial. Again, you want to have the information that you need to make this an informed decision. Again, if you'd like the list of these questions, please email me, or we'll try to get these posted on our IFOPA website. So social media has the benefits in a rare disease of providing great connection, but social media also has the opportunity to undermine ongoing clinical trials. We need to ensure confidentiality during clinical trials so that we're not intentionally unblinding the studies and introducing bias. So we have two don'ts for your consideration. First, do not post about your experience in social media about participating in a clinical trial. especially about any side effects that you may be having, or about how well you think or not well that you think the drug is working. Also, if you have any questions about participation in the study or about the study itself, that is best directed to the site investigator or the study coordinator who are trained to answer your questions. And we ask that you do not ask these questions in online forums. So as mentioned, this is a new dawn for FOP, and there are many drugs in both clinical development as well as early stage development for FOP. And we just want to highlight just the top three in terms of the ongoing clinical trials. So we have, just to highlight the first three, and we'll look to have a follow-up webinar that goes into much more detail on these drugs. So for the interest of this webinar, we'll only be covering these drugs at a very high level, and then we'll have a follow-up webinar to go into more detail about each trial. So starting at the bottom, we have rapamycin, which is approved medication as a immune suppressant, which is being repurposed or investigated in FOP. This is being conducted at Kyoto University. And it's very important to note that this is a Japan-only trial. So you need to be living in Japan to participate in this study. This is a phase 2 trial, and they're enrolling participants age 6 to 59 years of age, and there is a placebo arm in the study. Next, we, again, working from the bottom up, we have Regeneron. Trial for Regen2477. Regeneron completed a phase 1 study of Regen2477 in healthy volunteers and is now enrolling an international phase 2 trial. This study is being investigated. They're starting first in adults, and they're looking at ages 18 to 60 years of age for trial participants. And there is a placebo control group. However, after the 6-month placebo control portion of the study, all participants will have access to the study medication as part of an open label portion of their study. In terms of inclusion criteria, I just would like to note that we're only showing here the one inclusion criteria. For a full list of inclusion as well as exclusion criteria, we suggest you go to clinicaltrials.gov to have the full list or contact a study investigator. But here it's important to note that to be considered to be included in the Regen2477 trial, you need to have disease activity, FOP disease activity within 1 year of screening, and that your current flare-up symptom is acceptable and would qualify for inclusion. Regen2477 is a biologic, and most biologics need to be delivered through the vein. So Regen2477 is given as an IV infusion, and this study medication is given every 4 weeks. Clementia has completed their Part A portion of their phase 2 trial of palovarotene and are currently enrolling for their phase 3 trial, which is also an international study. And they are looking for participants ages greater than 4 years of age. The phase 3 palovarotene trial is using a natural history study as their control arm. So there will be no randomization and there will be no use of placebo in the study. In terms of their inclusion criteria, again, there are many inclusion criteria and exclusion criteria, but just to highlight that no flare symptoms in the past 4 weeks is one inclusion criteria to participate in the phase 3 study. By week 5, if you've not had any flare symptoms, you would be able to participate. Palovarotene is given orally. It's a pill, and you need to take the pill on a daily basis. Again, this is a very high-level view of 3 ongoing clinical trials. We will be looking to have follow-up webinars to go into each one of these in more detail. Finally, we have available resources for you. The best resource available for you is your treating physician or clinical investigator. These are the people you should be discussing these trials with and making your informed decisions. Clinicaltrials.gov is an online database of clinical studies. This is a very complete list of information about the studies. Many find this to be a little bit on the overwhelming. It's not very community friendly. However, we have information on the ifopa.org website that goes into more detail about these FOP trials. I'd also like to note that we did a write-up in one of our newsletters about the palovarotene in Regen 2477 studies. In that write-up, we had a nice FAQ about these studies, and you can access it also through the ifopa.org website here. The FDA has a nice website around clinical development, and you can, it's a patient-friendly view of what it takes to participate in clinical trials, and the address is listed here. And then finally, as discussed, if you'd like to learn more about the registry, the FOP registry, you can do so right through our ifopa.org website. And with that, I'd like to say thank you for listening. And at this stage, we have time for your questions. So we'll open it up. And Michelle, if you have questions that people have already submitted, we could begin going through those. Thank you. Again, if you have questions, you could submit it directly through